This is not just fun and games, and this is just not a discussion club that we're dealing with.
I mean, the United Nations is an organization that, if anybody's interested in saving life, when they hear the name United Nations, they should run in the opposite direction.
The UN will require that the Western world's standard of living, including such achievements as the private automobile and the single-family home, be reduced to a sustainable level. Such sacrifices will be mandatory to counter real or imagined threats, such as global warming, destruction of the ozone layer, and rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. No real scientific evidence need be produced. The doomsday claims of coercive utopians will suffice. Hence, limitations on family size will be strictly enforced as an added measure to protect the world's environment. And government licenses will be required for couples desiring children. No longer will anyone be allowed to protest or counter the ongoing destruction of property rights planned by various enforcers of environmental laws. The use of land will no longer be decided by those who hold title to it. In order to assure a natural and unmanaged environment, along with the recommended control of the land, agents of world government will spread throughout our nation to ensure compliance. Dr. Michael Kaufman, environmental analyst for Sovereignty International and author of Saviors of the Earth, The Politics and Religion of the Environmental Movement.
This particular belief system is really that philosophical expression of what we would normally call pantheism, the belief that nature is God, God is found in all things. And this is really the official religion or belief or philosophy of the United Nations. And it's expressed, it has some real downsides to it because it means basically if a law benefits man at the expense of nature, then that law is bad because it violates the basic theology of their belief system that everything should be equal. Humans shouldn't benefit at the expense of nature. Now you carry that far enough and ultimately you get to the point where no law is good because every law benefits man at the expense of nature, and man himself is bad. This perversion of our U.S. Constitution, where now a species has more rights than the human, comes right out of the United Nations. It comes in the form of the United Nations treaty called CITES, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, and this is the United Nations treaty. And this is how the United Nations is beginning to limit our sovereignty, is through these types of treaties.
Individuals who believe in the right to own property ought to be concerned. Americans believe in that. They're careless about it. Sometimes they allow our governments to regulate too much and to tax us too much. But really, the right of private property ownership is severely threatened by our own government. But it's going to be a lot worse if the United Nations gets involved. There is no way that you can have the concept of private property right. They believe in welfare redistribution, socialist redistribution, that everybody owns everything, and they would take from the wealthy and give to the poor to get an equal balance. Same old story that we've heard for years, but they do not protect the right to own private property by anything promoted by the United Nations.
All members of the U.S. Armed Forces will be given United Nations insignia along with the UN Military Manual. This manual spells out the new requirements regarding conduct, duties, and chain of command. U.S. markings will continue to appear on American uniforms. Soldiers wearing them will be employed primarily as enforcers of peace throughout the world, allowing the rest of mankind to know that the United States is cooperating in the establishment of the New World Order. Author of Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military, John McManus.
The central thesis of my book is that our military is being delivered to the United Nations. Now, I say that very carefully. It's not a case of the UN taking it over as much as our own leaders are delivering our military to the United Nations. The State Department finances a document called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. All right? Written by an MIT professor, Massachusetts Institute of Technology professor named Lincoln P. Bloomfield, who certainly happens to be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I just want to read a couple of things out of it here. In the definitions section, he says, finally, to avoid endless euphemism and evasive verbiage, the contemplated regime will occasionally be referred to unblushingly as world government. World government means scrap this, scrap the Declaration, scrap the Constitution. We're not going to have world government. If the UN had a monopoly on military force, what it would do is what it says in its own Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says the rights and freedoms that we Americans take for granted, and of course we shouldn't, they came from God, they came from the Creator. The rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Now, we've already gone over the fact that the purpose and the principles of the United Nations is to establish a world government with a monopoly of political and military power. It's very clear to me, and what we hope is that it will become far more clear to an awful lot more of the American people. We've got to get out of the United Nations.
The election process will become the task of world government monitors. The U.S. Congress, President, judicial system, and state and local government shall exist only as a facade to assure American citizens that they still have a voice in government. Checks and balances among branches of government will be eliminated. The states will become mere subdivisions of the national government, just as the national government will become a subdivision of the world government. The U.S. Constitution will be supplanted by the UN Charter and consigned to the ash heap of history, a useless relic of the past. Fortunately, more and more Americans are beginning to see the wisdom of what the John Birch Society has been saying for well over 3.5 decades. Get us out of the UN. March 20th, 1997, Capitol Hill. Texas U.S. Representative Ron Paul introduces one of the most crucial bills regarding the future of freedom, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. Its purpose, to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations.
Well, I don't think we need the United Nations to be able to talk to other nations. The United Nations was established in 1945. We talked to a lot of nations before that. We have our embassies, we have our ambassadors, we can pick up a telephone these days and talk to whoever we want around the world. So I do not think that is a legitimate excuse. That is just an excuse to do the bad things that the United Nations does. Every year since we belonged to the United Nations, we have lost a little bit of our sovereignty. And we're moving in that direction where eventually we will not have the United States of America and will be nothing more than a pawn of the United Nations.
It didn't take long for word to get out. Soon, Dr. Paul's office received messages from other representatives willing to co-sponsor the bill, and an avalanche of congratulatory letters from the American people thanking him for introducing this crucial bill covered his desk. June 4th, 1997, 54 representatives vote in favor of the Get Us Out measure. A few years ago, it was unlikely if 4 representatives would have supported it. Even though the measure didn't pass, the numbers are a solid indicator of the accelerated support for the United States' immediate withdrawal from the UN. And with the help of more and more Americans, Congress will again be forced to vote whether or not to get us out of the United Nations for good.
The Congress tends to be political at times. They tend to respond to what they hear. Now, if they think there's enough people in their district that want them to vote a certain way, they all of a sudden will become interested. The American people are starting to wake up. I think we're making a lot of progress, and I predict we're going to get a lot more votes next time.
Many Americans are working to influence Congress on important issues, several of which have been discussed in this program. Clearly, the Get Us Out issue stands above them all. For if we allow the UN to become an all-powerful government, victories in Congress will become meaningless, and the causes of single-issue activists will be permanently lost. But with your help, we can rescue our nation from the United Nations and preserve liberty for generations to come.